Started. So I'm David. I'm going to be chairing this session. And it's my pleasure to introduce Reuben, who works for the Maritime Museum, actually, in terms of boat restoration and boat building. He actually works a lot with volunteers there as well, quite interesting. But today's talk is all about sailing in general and sailing dinghies. And Reuben knows a lot more about this than I could even start to scratch just now. So without further ado, I'll just hand over to Reuben and let you do your talk.
Right, well, hello everyone. Hopefully it's going to be more interesting than the boring day outside. So, I'm just going to start by introducing not only myself, but what I do at the museum. So I'll just try and share my screen. Hopefully there we can see the presentation.
That's fine.
So, yeah, it's going to be on the evolution of the sailing dinghy. So how we got from kind of the start of the development to where we are today. But before I do that, I'm just going to introduce the Maritime Museum, where I work, and kind of tell you what I do there. So hopefully you all recognise the top left picture of inside the Maritime Museum. And you might also recognise the bottom left, the little workshop that you can see within the museum. And that's actually where I spend the majority of my time in normal circumstances, doing restorations, and people can come along and have a chat with us, ask us about the boat building that we're doing. And really I'm a bit of a live exhibit. And I'll be in there with usually 2 volunteers every day of the week. But then on the right, this bottom right, is something you might not have seen. That's our off-site storage facility, which is at Pontcharden, which is actually where the majority of our boats are. So there's a huge number of very important boats to the development of sailing in that collection. That unfortunately we can't have them all on display all the time, but there are a lot of them there. Which hopefully will rotate into the museum as time goes on. And then from the workshop side of it, it's something that's often sort of not recognised as much, that there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So these are all things that the workshop have done. So at the top left, that's a replica of Captain Bligh's launch. You might know the story of him being having a mutiny and having to sail over 3,600 miles to safety. So this bottom middle picture actually is during the construction, and then the top left is the boat sailing. So that was a couple of years ago that we did that. And then these 2 pictures on the right, that's a replica of a Titanic lifeboat that we built for the exhibition that the museum did on the Titanic disaster. And then top middle, we've got a little fishing boat, a local fishing boat that was restored. And bottom left, there's one of our sailing collection. She's a boat is actually very well known around the world. She circumnavigated without an engine. So we made it all the way back to Falmouth, and she's now part of a collection. So if you're ever out on the water, you might be able to catch a view of her. And then this is our project at the moment that I'm leading in the workshop. If you come into the museum, you'll see this. It's a steam launch from about 1912. We're doing a full restoration on it. We've replaced every single frame throughout it, and now we're just installing the steam plant. So hopefully whatever your interests, whether it's mechanical or in the wooden boat building, there'll be something in the museum workshop that you can be interested in. And then finally, the people from the museum would kill me if I didn't give a little plug to this. At the moment, the new exhibition is Monsters of the Deep. It's very focusing on the myths and the legends and how they developed. So as you can see there's a couple of pictures of the specimens that we got in the museum. We've got over 500 specimens from various places like the Natural History Museum. We've got some hoax mermaids like the one in the bottom right. Yeah, hopefully you are all the sort of people who will want to go and see that. So go and check that out. So now onto the what you really probably came here to hear about. So I'm going to be talking about the transition from about 1920s, which is when the photo on the left is from, to the modern day with the photo on the right. And the reason I'm starting at 1920s is because really there were no major changes up to that point. If you took one of those boats there back to Nelson's Navy and sailed it past them, no one would bat an eyelid. And to be honest, before that, you'd need to go back another 100 years or so before anyone sort of thought there was anything different. That construction techniques, Vikings would be with it. It's really up until the 1920s, there wasn't a huge amount of development in the sailing boats. So yeah, and in this talk, I'm going to be really talking about monohulls. So that's boats with one hull rather than two hulls, which is a catamaran, or three, which is a trimaran. It would be a much longer talk if I had to go through all of those different types. So yeah, the thing that happened in the 1920s that really brought the development forwards a big step was what's called planing. So you can see these two boats here, they're actually skimming along the surface. They're sat in the water, they're skimming along the surface. And while this might seem like a very mundane development, it's a much bigger step than it might seem. And to understand why, you need to do a bit of how a boat moves and how it's where its resistance comes from. So this series shows a boat getting faster, and this number one, you can see it's got a very small wave that's a high frequency. So we've got two waves actually. So the blue one here is the bow wave. So that's the wave that's made as the boat moves and it pushes the water out of the way. And then we've also got this red one at the back. So that's where the water is rushing back in to fill the space the boat has just left. So as the boat gets faster, so we go towards number two, you can see the waves get longer. And interestingly, it's the way that the bow wave and the stern wave interact. So in this one, number two, you can see that the peak of the stern wave coincides with the trough of the stern wave, and that means they to some extent cancel out. But then if you look at number three, it's gone a little bit faster and they're actually joining up. So instead of knocking each other out, they actually exaggerate each other and you end up with a much bigger wave. And obviously if you're using the energy from the sails to make a wave rather than move the boat, it'll slow you down an awful lot. And then finally, if you look at number four, you can see that because it's going fast enough, the one wave is actually the same length as the boat. So for this boat to go any faster, it effectively has to go sail uphill, which heavy boat, it's just really not going to do that. So to overcome that speed barrier, there's two very important things you need. So you need to be light enough that it can sail uphill, and also it's got to have a flat section at the back so it can begin to skim. So up until that point, boats couldn't be built light enough to do that climb. So the hull shape hadn't developed. And that's one of the reasons. Look at this really old boat. It has these very graceful overhangs at the front and back. So that effectively extended the length that wave could be. So it could get to being faster than it would be if it was measured at the length of the waterline. So here I think you can see the development from Radiant on the left to Avenger on the right. The main thing is this area here, that on Radiant before, it was quite deep and sharp, whereas on Avenger, it was much flatter. That allowed it to get up and start skimming along the surface of the water. So this happened in the 1920s. This was 1928. Avenger on the right was the real breakthrough boat. And it was successful to such an extent that out of the 57 races she entered that year, she won 52, came second in 2 of them, and third in 3 of them. So you can see what a massive leap it was suddenly. The boats went from being restricted to sort of 5 knots or so 6 miles an hour, to really sort of how strong the wind was that they could go. And this was a guy called Uffa Fox, his name will pop up again because he was very active at this point, and he was an excellent boat builder from the Isle of Wight. There's a number of his boats in the museum and in our collection at the moment. So yeah, that was planing, and you can see it in this boat here very well, that the bow wave isn't forming at the bow. It's actually forming about halfway along the boat. So the boat has climbed over the wave and it's started to skim. And then underwater here, there'll be a flat section that's enough to support that weight. So in the same way that a stone, if you want to skim a stone, it's got to be nice and flat. The back of the boat here has to be flat. And you can really see how that boat's really going a lot faster than it would have been if it was just sat in the water steady. So that really took us up to the sort of 1930s. That was the pinnacle of sailing. But obviously, without the restriction to how fast the boats could go, of course, everyone started increasing the sail area, because the bigger the sails are, the more power you get and the faster you go. But of course, this brings a problem, because if you can probably see from that boat there, a huge amount of sail on rather a small boat. And if you're on board that, you'd have to be quite active to keep it from just tipping over and sending you for a swim. So the next thing that happened was the development of the trapeze, as it's known. So you can see from these photos, you have a harness and you have a wire to the top of the mast, and that allows you to stand on the side of the boat, and you can get a lot more leverage to keep the boat upright. And this is a point in sailing that I think really highlights the social aspect of sailing, that up to this point, sailing had really been the preserve of some very wealthy individuals, people of more than means. And that was reflected here, that this boat called Thunder and Lightning, which designed by Uffa Fox, just like Avenger, the last big development, it sailed one race in Falmouth, and it won it convincingly. And so the International Yacht Racing Union banned the use of the trapeze because it was unsportsmanlike. And while the gentlemen of the day liked to sit around in their tweed suits, the use of the trapeze was quite athletic. So none of the established people wanted this to become a thing. They wanted to keep their rather refined gentleman sport. So actually this device was banned for 15 years by the Yacht Racing Union, because they just didn't want you to make it a sport as we might see it now. And as I said, it was Uffa Fox who designed this, and it was a guy called, what was his name? I forgot it. No, Peter Scott was the one who sailed it, and tried insult to the injury of not being able to use it. Peter Scott was the one who was forced to write the rules banning the use of the trapeze. So because he obviously knew how it worked and could write the rule best. So this is Thunder and Lightning in the museum itself. So it is hung up today. So yeah, hopefully if you go, you'll see it hung up today. And although it might look like a very sort of normal boat, you might be able to get history. So yeah, go and have a look if you're in the museum. And while this boat, I've put this in, even though this is a bang up to date boat, it really exemplifies these two developments that we've seen so far. So if you look at the shape of the boat, you can see it's very flat. You may as well have a flat sheet of plywood there. It's completely flat, so it really promotes that skimming along the surface of the water. And then also the trapeze is taken to its extreme. So you've not got one, but you've got three people or trapezers on the outside of these wings, these racks that you can see, really giving the maximum leverage. And you can tell from the photo that those two things combined really make a very exciting boat that can obviously go rather fast. So that really brings us up to the 40s, because the trapeze was developed in 1937. So then obviously we were into the war years. But that as well had a very interesting implications for sailing boats. So this plane, some of you might recognize it as a Mosquito bomber. So this was developed partway through the Second World War in response to the to the lack of availability of metals for building aeroplanes. So this plane was actually built from wood. So in top left photo, you can see the construction line that they had, that wood had been properly productionized, that you could have a whole production line. You can see the bottom left, bottom right photo, that you can see it's a really complex shape that they've managed to develop out of wood. And this is actually a screenshot from a YouTube video that, if you're interested in this, I would really recommend going to check out. British Pathway have a wonderful selection of boat building videos, actually. And in this photo, it shows the techniques that they used. So they had these thin strips of wood laid diagonally around a mold, and then they'd wrap it up in this bag and then cook it in an oven, and that would consolidate these layers of wood together, and that would allow you to build a very complex shape very quickly. You didn't need the same level of craftsmanship to fit each individual plank. You just laid all these thin layers on and then glued them all together, and it gave a very rot resistant and stiff structure. And the way that this boat came about, that they're making there, which is called a Firefly, is because at the end of the Second World War, Fairley, which were the company that made the Mosquito bomber, suddenly had a lot of excess capacity in their factories. But they had a marine. So after the war, one bright spark came up with the idea that they'd use this technique to make sailing boats. So in 1946, so just after the war, Uffa Fox, that same designer, designed this boat called the Firefly. And here, of course, is the first Firefly hung up in the museum. Sadly, it's not there right now. I took that photo last year, but we do have that boat in our collection. And when Fairley Aviation first started making these boats, they made demonstration boats to take around to lots of different sailing clubs, and they called them Fee, Fi, Fo, and Fum. And this boat that we have is Fee, so it is the very first Firefly. It's still a type of boat that's sailed around today. You can still buy brand new boats, although they are now made of fiberglass. So the designer boat has still stood the test of time. And it's especially popular with universities. They do a lot of sailing in them. And so really the next big development after the first production boat was plywood. It might seem a very everyday thing to now, but back when it was first conceived, it revolutionized boat building, because this boat here that you see is called the Mirror, and it's at one point it was the designer boat that there were most of in the world, and there's over 100,000 of them today. But initially, it was sponsored by the Mirror newspaper, hence the name. It was aimed at popularizing sailing. So you could buy a kit that was sponsored by the newspaper, and allow everyone to get involved in sailing. So while this might not be a high performance boat, it was actually instrumental to the development of boats, because at this point, now in the sort of 50s and 60s, it wasn't just the preserve of craftsmen and people who had money that could afford a boat. It suddenly became something that anyone could buy on a reasonable budget. And also from the point of view of development, it opened up innovation to absolutely everyone. So instead of being a handful of boat builders around the country who were innovating, it was thousands of different enthusiasts who were going out every weekend and just testing things. So although this didn't signify a massive jump in the sort of top end of performance for boats, there were just so many little innovations that were made that we still have today, just different ways of doing things with ropes, little gadgets. So no kind of big quantum leaps, but just a whole host of individual little developments that just came about because everyone could could build it in their garage. And there's many people out there, myself included, who grew up learning to sail in these things. I think about half of the current Olympic British sailing squad learned to sail in one of these boats. So I think that really shows how important the development of plywood was to the overall development of sailing. So that really brings up to really the late 1960s. There weren't any big developments, there was lots of little ones. But the next big one was hydrofoils, which, as you can see in this photo here, it's where the boat's actually lifted up out the water. So it's got little wings under the water, down on the end of these, what you might know as keels. So it has a little wing under the water, and that brings the boat out of the water and reduces the resistance to a fraction of what it previously was, which allows much greater speeds. So this boat here is built for a competition called the America's Cup, and they will generally achieve about 3 times the wind speed, which is quite incredible. But to go back through the development of hydrofoils, this was one of the first made sort of serious attempts at hydrofoils, and it was actually sponsored by the US Navy. So this is called Monitor, and it had these ladder hydrofoils, as they're called. So you can see either side, there's a whole series of rungs that were little aerofoils, effectively, to lift the boat out the water. And the theory behind having all these different ladders was that the faster the boat went, the more lift they generated, and the higher out the water it rose, and therefore the fewer of them were in the water. Which it did work, and this boat was a massive leap forward. Although this was 1955 that this one first took flight. It wasn't really taken seriously for a few years, because you can see it's a very cumbersome arrangement. If you've got these ladders hanging out, hitting anything in the water, or just being generally in the way. And I think also people looked at them and said, well, that looks a bit silly. So for a while that was where it stuck. But really, this was 1974 that this boat called Mayfly really sort of brought hydrofoiling forwards. So in the same way that the Monitor before lifted out the water, and the further it got out the water, the less hydrofoil was in the water, as a sort of self-regulating thing. The same thing applied to Mayfly, but more importantly, they hadn't sort of had to over-engineer it. There'd been developments in materials, sort of fiberglass had started to come out, and carbon fiber and all the composites were all coming in. So rather than having a whole series of different wings, they could all do it on one wing either side, which was a lot more efficient. They didn't have the drag of carrying around a ladder with them. And this boat actually seemed to hit quite a sort of optimum area that wouldn't really be hit again for a while. So the records that this boat set stood for about 20 or so years, until someone else managed to get it sort of spot on, and really until we managed to start using computers to optimize sort of the size and the shape of the hydrofoil. So yeah, Mayfly was a very important boat. Sadly, we haven't got her in the collection. I'd love to take her for a sail, but doubt that's going to happen. And after the Mayfly, this boat is actually the same design of boat. It's called a Moth. This really took over the hydrofoiling and really took it into the DNA of this boat. So the boat on the left, you can see it's reduced the number of hydrofoils further. It's just got the 2 on the centre line and 2 out to the side, which give it a really stable platform for hydrofoiling. And also there was a bit of what's called active control. So rather than it just being the height of the boat just being controlled by virtue of how much hydrofoil was in the water, this one actually tilted the front hydrofoil forwards and backwards to regulate the height out the water that the boat was sailing. And then you can see the one on the right, that was in 1999, that design, that won the World Championships that year. And it had removed the central forward one and you'd now gone to just the two, one either side, which again was a reduction in the amount of hydrofoils in the water, which obviously was a reduction in the amount of drag, which allowed it to go a lot faster. And then finally, this class has really brought it right up to date with the centerline foils. You can see how much cleaner this is than the initial monitor. So it's just got these two vertical ones, and underneath the water there's a horizontal one, just a single wing to lift the boat. And this little, what's called a wand, dangling off the front, that just touches the water, and through a series of levers, that controls the angle of the hydrofoil on the bottom of the centerboard here. So it is a very active control. It doesn't, instead of having all the hydrofoils with you all the time, it just tilts it to get a bit more lift, which is obviously much more efficient. So these boats will go sort of 2 or 3 times the wind speed when they really get going, and they're still seen as the sort of pinnacle of development. You'll see lots of sort of Olympic world champions decide to go and test their stuff in this class, and really see what they can do, because they're a very difficult boat to sail. Obviously, you're balancing on 2 quite narrow areas, and the spectacular crashes when they do fail are well worth a quick Google or a YouTube at some point. There's some brilliant footage of them absolutely wiping out. So that really brings us up to date in terms of the boat development. But alongside that, sailing technique has moved a long way. You might be wondering why there's a picture of a dog hanging out a car. But I think this really is key to how boat sailing has changed. So if you think of the dog with its head out the window, it always feels the wind as if it's coming from straight ahead, it seems fairly obvious that that's made by the car moving. And in sailing, that wind that you feel is known as apparent wind, because exactly the same thing happens when you're moving. And hopefully this isn't going to get too technical, but if we're just going to consider the problem of getting from A to B with a 10-mile-an-hour wind, it might seem fairly obvious that the quickest way between those 2 points is the straight line. But just to prove that it isn't, we'll just, for a second, presume that this boat is 100% efficient. So it'll be going at 10 miles an hour in 10 miles an hour of wind, which seems very obviously the quickest that you can go. But that's not the case. If instead we start off going in a completely different direction with our 100% efficient boat, we will go at 10 miles an hour in 10 miles an hour of wind. But if you think of the dog with its head out the window and it feels the wind, because you're moving forwards at 10 miles an hour of wind, at 10 miles an hour, you will feel 10 miles an hour coming straight back at you like that. But of course, you can't have the 2 different winds, so they combine to form a strong wind from a slightly different angle. But then this isn't the end of the story, because with our 100% efficient boat, we end up going at 15 miles per hour in our 15 miles per hour apparent wind, as it's known. And of course, you can see that this process will repeat itself. You're actually sailing in the combination of your 10 miles per hour wind and the 15 miles per hour that you're generating. So in this situation, you'd probably end up with something around sort of 17 miles per hour. And of course, then you'll keep going. But this can't keep going forever, because obviously, if you end up sailing straight away from the wind, it'll cancel itself out, and you'll be sailing straight into wind. So yeah, the 10 miles an hour would cancel each other out. So this can't go on forever. But that's not something that really is a problem, because boats in reality are never 100% efficient. So this final boat here at 17 miles per hour is a fairly reasonable place to end up. And the highest performance boats we have now will do over 3 times the wind speed. So they could get up to about 30 miles per hour in a 10 miles per hour wind, which it seems crazy if you just say that out loud. But once you understand that it can do this process of turning away and then ending up going much faster than the wind, it makes sense. So if we go back to our original problem of getting from A to B, rather than going in a straight line, if we actually sail a bit of a different course via sea, we might have sailed a much longer distance, but we'll get there a lot faster. So this is known as apparent wind sailing, where you're generating your own wind and increasing the wind that you're sailing in. So while this might not be a development as such, this is something that's been developed alongside all these developments in design. So nowadays, sailing is not limited by the wind speed. It's more on the efficiency of the boat for the really high performance boats. Most boats you'll sail won't be able to do it to this extent, but generally there's some high performance boats out there that can do this and sail a lot faster than the wind. So really that's brought us up to date. So, which obviously poses the question, where are we going next? And I think this is obviously my kind of estimations. I think that wing sails are going to become much more prevalent. So this boat here is a very high performance boat. This is one that would go about 3 times the wind speed. It has this wing sail. So instead of one sheet of fabric, it's got this 3-dimensional construction of carbon fiber and plastic film, which has a much better ratio of lift to drag, which is what you need to go really fast. So this isn't a development as such, because it's already happened. So it's not something that we'll see coming. But this picture on the right, you can see that to use a boat like this, you need a massive storage shed, which obviously most people don't have. Most people can just roll a sail up at the end of the day and go home. So unless you've got a massive amount of money for a big shed and also a crane to lift it in every time you want to go sailing, you can't use this technology. And also they're very fragile. So whereas a normal sail, fabric sail, will just flap, these wings will disintegrate in a high wind, and they'll be thousands of pounds to replace. So they're completely impractical for today. But the development that I see happening is making it sort of much more accessible to the everyday people. So on the left, this is an experimental boat using an inflatable sail. So you get the efficiency of it being a 3D shape, which gives you much more lift, but you can deflate it, which is a very radical idea, and it certainly hasn't taken off, but as a proof of concept, that's there. And then on the right, which I think is far more where we're going to see it go, that's a fabric sail around 3D shapes. It might be a bit hard to see what's going on there, but you've effectively got your profile on a very thin piece of carbon fiber with the sail around it. So you can still hoist the sail and lower it. You don't have to store it in its entirety. So if I had to put my money on something, I'd say that would be the next development in the sailing story. Or these are two boats that are very, very different and are right at the cutting edge of experimentation. So the one on the left, this rather strange looking device, is actually the world record holder for speed sailing. And it managed to get 65 knots, which is sort of somewhere around 70 miles an hour. And it's got a completely different geometry to the normal boats you might see. And while it uses hydrofoils, just as most high performance boats, it uses them in a completely different way. You can just make out underneath the boat here, that thing there is a hydrofoil, but instead of lifting the boat, it's actually holding it down. And this boat actually gets its lift from the sail. You can see the sail is tilted rather than being vertical, so it actually lifts the boat as well as driving it forward. And then this hydrofoil holds it down into the water. And it's a very strange boat, but it obviously works because it holds the world record. Or alternatively, this boat on the right, these boats, this is made for the America's Cup, which is it's actually the oldest sporting trophy. I think it's 1804. I think it was the first competition. So it's been around for a long time. But every 4 years, there's a competition. And the next one will be happening next year, and it'll be competed in these boats. So it might look a bit strange, but it's got these the hydrofoils on either side that can move. So it engages one at a time. So in the same way that the trapeze increases your leverage, this kind of takes the opposite approach, and it moves the hydrofoil out to the leeward side, it's called, the side away from the wind. So it gives a much wider, stable base. But obviously, this isn't going to be something that I think you'll see sailing around the harbour anytime soon. These things cost millions and millions of pounds, and currently this technology isn't really available in the sort of public domain, because these teams are still developing it, and they won't be racing until next year. So there's sort of the same amount of secrecy as you'd see around sort of Formula One teams and their developments. But hopefully in a few years' time, we might see that sort of technology trickle down. So that's really the development up to where we are at the moment. But I think just before I hand back over and ask for questions, there's just a few sort of honourable mentions of where it didn't go, but it could have done. So we've got some rather strange boats here. On the top, you can see, instead of making the boat lean over, they've made the mast lean over, which there's a solid theory behind it, because one of the challenges with designing a sailing boat is that you have to design it not only to sail upright, but also to be able to sail at an angle and still be efficient. So the theory behind that boat was obviously that if you make the mast lean over, rather than the whole boat, you can design the shape of the boat to work perfectly upright, and you know that it's always going to be upright. But obviously that hasn't come to fruition, and you probably have never seen a boat like that sailing around, and for good reason, because the mechanical complexity just makes it unfeasible, to be honest. So that was one theory that didn't quite go anywhere. And the boat on the right, you can see that's actually a much more modern boat. That was, I think it was about 2015 that one was experimented with. And in the same way, again, it's the same sort of theory as a trapeze, that they've moved this ballast bulb out to this side. So rather than having a keel underneath as you traditionally would, it has this ballast moved all the way out to one side. And while this might not have sort of come around as the sort of everyday, it was a bit of a proof of concept and allowed a bit of development in that direction. But maybe we'll see some more experimentation in that direction in years to come. And then finally, we got these two very weird things. So starting with the one on the right, it is fairly obvious to see what's happening there. They've just connected a wind turbine, and they've got a propeller underwater. So it works. And to some enthusiasts somewhere, it's probably something special. And it is something special, but not necessarily in the best of ways. It's a theory that was tried and it worked. And then on the left, this is actually a very, very interesting boat propulsion technique, that instead of sails, it's got these things called Flettner rotors. So these things have actually got to be powered, and they spin slowly. And they work off, because that makes the air on one side of the cylinder move faster than the air on the other side of the cylinder, which creates a pressure differential, which does actually provide some movement forwards. And while it might look a bit silly, and you probably haven't seen a boat like that, you might be in years to come, because there's a company in Norway that currently makes Flettner rotors to be retrofitted to cargo ships and cruise ships, and they are making a success of it, and they are actually becoming more sort of sensible, as cargo ships are obviously reliant on fuels which they're wanting to move away from, and becoming more efficient by putting a couple of Flettner rotors on top actually makes a lot of sense. So I think it all goes to show that if you've got a crazy idea, you might try it, and who knows, maybe one day it'll turn into something exciting and useful. Yeah, I think that brings me to the end of what I've prepared to talk about. So I think I'll hand back over to David now and see if anyone wants to ask any questions.
Thank you very much, Reuben. That was amazing. Yeah, these last couple of posts you showed, they just look brilliant. Yeah, awesome. Especially for someone like me who was completely naive about sailing. I feel like I've got a really good idea of boats and how they work in general as well now. So I really enjoyed that, and your wind diagrams as well. Nice touch.
Good. I didn't confuse anyone with them.
No, I like them. They did clarify things for me. So yeah, as Reuben said, if anyone does have any questions, now is the time. Feel free to use the chat. We've already had a few questions come in. So if you've got anything you want to ask Reuben about or talk about, I guess, just feel free to put that in the chat. If you do want to come on as well and ask your question in person, you can indicate that in the chat or raise your hand virtually over Zoom. There should be a function as well, just over the chat window for me. So fantastic. Yeah, I've got so many questions that I'd love to ask myself as well. I will just keep it to one before going over to other questions as well, see if we have more time later too. So these, the hydrofoils that you talked about, I'm just absolutely fascinated by them. So how do they lift essentially? Is it basically like having little wings underneath the water that then help the boat lift off?
Yes, it is exactly the same as an aeroplane wing. So if you took a cross-section of aeroplane wing and a cross-section of a hydrofoil, it would be more or less exactly the same. They just don't have to be quite as big because obviously water is much denser than air. So you can get the same lift out of a much smaller area. Yeah, exactly the same as a bird wing as well, all the same theory. Yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah, that actually goes over really nicely into another thing I was wondering. When you mentioned bird wings, I was wondering if there's anything else where it's cases of stealing technology from nature, as it often happens with technological development.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the same as the bird wing. And there's a lot of crossover with aeronautical engineering. So the really high performance boats, their kind of development teams, they often steal people from Formula One and aviation industries. And obviously they steal from the from nature with the bird wing.
Yeah.
But then there are also some innovations in terms of surface finishing. So a couple of years ago, there was a bit of a scandal in, I think it was swimming suits in the Olympics, that they developed a surface finish based on shark skin that lowered the drag of the swimsuit below a certain amount. There's been the same kind of thing with sailing, that there's surface finishes you can apply to a boat if you want the ultimate in low resistance. And there's always people trying to sort of spray silicone spray on the bottom of the boat before a race. So always things like that.
Awesome, thank you. This talk about aeronautics really leads us in very nicely to the first audience question from Robin. Of all things, he's not asking about boats, but about the one aeroplane you mentioned, the Bomber, made of wood. Robin's wondering if it's single ply, if you know anything about that.
But I think for the Firefly, it was 3 different layers. So the first ones that they built, the 4 demonstration boats, they had one diagonal one way, one the other way, and then the final one was actually planked as if it was a normal boat. I think that was just for aesthetic reasons. But later they did switch back to just 3 layers diagonally laid on top of each other. It gives quite a distinctive look. But yeah, 3 is the sort of normal with that technique.
So very similar to the boat house we showed afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly the same. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. The next question we had was from Colin, asking something a bit more technical about the Puma boat you showed. I think that was one of the more modern hydrofoil pictures you had. Colin's wondering if the feedback is fully automatic.
Oh, with the moth and the wand hanging out the bottom. Was that the one?
I'm assuming so.
Because the first one, the monitor with those ladders out the side, that would have been fully automatic. That just the amount of boat in the water, the amount of hydrofoil in the water would obviously affect the amount of lift that it got. So it would reach an equilibrium by itself. But the more modern moth with the wand hanging out the bottom and touching the water, that's a fully mechanical system. You've got some adjustability of how high it'll make the boat sail, but that one's much more mechanical. It doesn't do it by itself, as it were, in the same way as the first ones did.
Thank you. I'm also wondering, for my benefit and maybe some others who aren't as well versed in sailing, could you explain to us what the feedback on a boat like that means?
Oh, right. Sorry, I didn't explain that as well at the time. So effectively, when the boat is sat down in the water, that wand would have been sort of horizontal, and through a series of levers, that would have meant that the angle of attack on the hydrofoil would be quite steep to try and get as much lift as possible. But as the boat rose out of the water, that wand, the angle would change till it was just touching the water. And then again, through a series of mechanical levers, that would level off. So it would sort of regulate itself that as the boat goes down, the wand tips up and the hydrofoil tips up to get more lift. But as it lifts up, it reduces the angle to reduce the lift to kind of reach its equilibrium.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah. That gives me a good idea of what it is you're talking about. I've got another question from Robin. He's asking about sail design and choppiness and waves. So is it still the case that the limiting factor in designing now with 3D sails is not the energy you can harness for speed, but the stability of a boat at high speeds? Thinking about water being choppy and that tiny shifts in wind direction can have a huge impact. So what is it really that's the limiting factor? Is it the energy you can harness from the wind for sails, or is it the actual stability of the boats themselves?
Well, stability obviously has a massive impact because in the same way we talked about apparent wind and how the movement of a boat influences the wind you feel. If you're going up and over waves and rocking about a lot, the wind direction would seem to vary a lot, even if the wind direction is staying constant just because of your movement. So yes, the sort of stability of the boat would limit the amount of energy you could get from the sails. But if you think of what hydrofoil does, it actually removes part of that from the equation because you're above the waves, you're not affected by them in the same way. So you have a much more stable platform, which allows the sail to harness much more energy. So the development of hydrofoils wasn't just reducing resistance, it was also allowing a much better use of the sail and the energy you could get from that. But nowadays, really, the limiting factor seems to be the hydrofoils and how little resistance you can make them draw, really.
Yeah, it sounds like the hydrofoils were a big breakthrough.
Yeah, it wasn't just an isolated thing. It happened in conjunction with all the other developments around.
Yeah. We've got a bit of a sidetrack question here from Henry after this. He says, fascinating talk. And just as a sidetrack, is curious how the museum has coped with lockdown. Very topical and timely.
Well, yeah, we did have to shut down for a few weeks, well, for a few months actually. But we are now back open again. Visitors are allowed back in on a limited basis that they have to book ahead. I think there are a limited number available on the door, but really book ahead if you want to go. And most of the museum is back open again. There's just a few things that you can't do, like go up the tower and down to the tidal zone at the bottom with underwater windows, just because the logistics of getting a one-way system up a spiral staircase wasn't really doable. But the rest of the museum is open again, including Café. So yeah, all back open again. So go and have a look.
That's great to hear. There's a few really nice comments in the chat from a lot of people. Obviously really enjoyed your talk, so do have a read through that later on before you leave, I think. We have the next question is from Steve here. He says, sail design has clearly changed significantly since the 1920s. So has sail design then influenced dinghy design, or was it the other way around, that has been a response to the changes in the design of the boats themselves?
I think initially there wasn't really much point in developing sails beyond what they were, because obviously before planing came about, so that's where you could get up and skim, the speed of the boat was limited, so it didn't really matter how much power you applied to the boat, it wouldn't climb over its own bow wave. So up to that point, sails hadn't changed much. And really since then, there has been quite a bit of development in the materials. I think that's been the main thing with sails, that you get lighter ones that don't absorb water, with a smoother surface finish, that allow much better shape. And then probably the latest developments has been 3D sails, as they're called. So where they're plastic sails of a very thin film, and they're molded over a 3D surface. So rather than being cut from different panels to get the right shape, they're molded in a computer designed shape, which allows a much more efficient, efficient shape that's optimized. and with a much lower drag because it's a thin film of plastic. So if you look out at a boat racing in the harbour, you'll probably be able to see the ones that have got more expensive sails because they're plastic and they're see-through often as well. So laminate sails are a big development. So.
Great, cheers. I think I just want to highlight this one comment from Mahira as well, just so you know how far this talk is spreading, I guess. She sails later in the mangrove creeks of Karachi, Pakistan. I thought it was very interesting to learn about sailboat development just now. So we'll move on to another question from Robin again, who's, like me, obviously fascinated about the hydrofoils and the planing development in hulls from the 1928s, from 1928. So Robin's wondering if that was more of a practical experiment or actually the impact of quite a solid theoretical understanding of fluid dynamics. So I'm guessing this boils down to, is this one of the wacky ideas that just stuck, or was this a deliberate?
Well, I think people probably had come across the idea because they've been towing small boats behind big boats. They probably would have seen to some extent what happened if you just applied a load of force to a small boat and made it go far above the speed that it was kind of designed for. So there might have been a bit of that. And also I think Uffa Fox really was a visionary. So Uffa Fox was the guy who designed the first planing one. But it wasn't necessarily the first planing boat. There were a few people playing around with this idea, but it was Uffa Fox as a boat builder who really had the opportunity to put the theory that had been going around for a while into practice with his boat building business, because he already built high performance boats for the day. So it was a kind of coincidence of the theories developing, and this Uffa Fox had the opportunity at the time to put the theory into practice. So it wasn't necessarily a wacky idea that was too far out there. It just happened to be that was the right sort of coincidence to make it happen.
So nothing quite as out there as boats with rotating pillars on top back in the day.
No, nothing quite as radical, but it was a massive step forward at the time, and
yeah,
it proved it was possible. So.
We've got another question from Steve as well. He's asking about movable dagger boards and at what point they entered dinghy design and if they were a game changer. Just to tack onto that, what are movable dagger boards?
So a dagger board is kind of what it sounds like. It's a board that sticks down into the water and it resists the boat being pushed sideways. So it's kind of what some people might think of as a keel. But on small boats where there's not ballast, they're often referred to as centre boards or dagger boards. So movable dagger boards, if you obviously twist the dagger board, you can make it, instead of just keeping the boat from moving sideways, you can actually make it move sideways a little bit. So in the same way that you can angle the hydrofoil to get lift vertically, you can angle the dagger board to get lift side to side. So movable dagger boards, I don't know exactly when they came in. I would suspect sometime in the sort of 50s would have been where they were first experimented with. And there's actually a boat in the museum called Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious that has an early example of a movable dagger board. But in a way, I wish I had a whiteboard here because there's some very interesting things with how they're not actually as efficient as theoretically they might be.
I can put up a virtual whiteboard for you if you want to give that a go.
I don't know. Maybe if suffice to say that they haven't made as much of an impact as they might have sort of thought that they might. But they are still in use in some high performance boats. So they're obviously better than not having them.
If you do want to play around with a virtual whiteboard, feel free. Otherwise, we can obviously just leave that by the side. So, in absence of too many questions coming through at the moment, I thought I can go back to one of my own as well. So, thinking back to the very beginning of your talk, where you said there's not really been many breakthroughs before the 1920s, and for hundreds of years, presumably, sailing boats stayed more or less the same. I was wondering if there was any other reason for this other than just that the materials weren't light enough. So any sort of cultural change, because you did mention that the America's trophy was back from the early 1800s, so there was obviously a big interest in sailing even before that point. Is there anything else that happened in the early 1900s and that changed things?
Well, the America's Cup is mainly for bigger boats rather than the small sailing boats. And obviously, when you've got a bigger boat, to overcome the barrier that was planing, it required much more. So that really came sort of 40s, 50s, which is when bigger boats started plane. But up to that point, I think it probably was a materials thing. So the boats that on the first slide that I showed, they had what's called a clinker boat building technique where the planks overlap. And that's exactly the same technique that the Vikings would have used on their long ships. And that was really the lightest way to build a boat up until that point. But then one of the things that Uffa Fox developed was a new technique using very thin planks. So instead of just having one layer of planks, he'd have two layers of planks again at diagonals to each other with very thin frames to hold it together. So there was a bit of a development in building technique at that time, which probably was the catalyst that allowed boats to be built light enough. So yeah, I think it was materials development and construction techniques that allowed that development to take place.
So it does sound like it was probably more technological breakthroughs than driving general interest rather than suddenly.
Yeah. Even if someone had gone and designed a boat that would be capable of planing, they wouldn't have been able to build it before that point, really.
Awesome, thanks. We did just have another couple of questions coming from Robin and Steve as well. Both of them seem to be on fire tonight. So Robin says it was fascinating to realize how much could only be learned from the actual activity of reconstruction. It wasn't just for nostalgia, it was real science. So I guess that one's more of a comment. But yeah, really cool to see that, hear about that side of things as well. So Steve says you've mentioned composite advances influencing design mainly in the context of hydrofoils. Have they been as influential in other aspects of dinghy design too?
Well, they're used in every part of a boat nowadays. If you go and buy and probably the weight really affects the stability of the boat.
Sorry, Reuben, I'm afraid the first
so in that way it's made
completely gone for me.
It's just said stable and unstable connection. So yeah, I just said about how how composites are used in every part of a boat nowadays. And if you buy a sort of reasonably high performance boat, that every part almost will be made of composites. So the masts and the hull and the daggerboard and all the boat will be made of composites. And it especially makes a difference on the mast, because obviously the higher something is, the more effect it has on stability. So having carbon fibre masts has been a huge development. And then also obviously in popularising it and making it much cheaper to get out in the water, because the cost of making a fiberglass boat is a fraction of making a wooden boat. So again, even more than plywood, it's made it much more affordable for much more people to get on the water and play around and make their own innovations.
That's really interesting. I wouldn't have really thought offhand that wooden boats are more expensive than, but yeah, obviously. Yeah. So I'm wondering as well, in terms of the restorations that you do for the museum, if the techniques and sort of things you use are also appropriate for the era that boat is from, or if there's any shortcuts that you use just to get it to appear authentic, I'm guessing.
Well, we do try to keep the techniques as much as possible. And to be honest, if you're restoring a wooden boat, the techniques that you got to use are the ones that the wooden boat builders would have used. The only real cheat that I think the main cheat that we use is the way that we get planks. So now obviously we can just run a tree through a saw and end up with some straight planks, whereas historically, if they wanted a straight plank, they needed a straight tree. But nowadays we can sort of cut it how we want, which in a way it actually makes a worse quality plank, because the grain doesn't run in the same direction as the plank necessarily runs. And also obviously we've got glues to make things waterproof. But generally when we're doing a restoration in the workshop, we do stick to the techniques that they would have used at the time. So if you see us doing something in the workshop, it'll probably be what they would have done building the boat in the first place.
That's awesome too. Are there any other boat stores at the museum as well, or is it all you?
Well, I'm the only, well, there's two of us who are employed in the workshop area. I'm mainly at the museum, and then there's another guy at the off-site boat store. And then we have a massive team of volunteers. I think there's a couple of them watching at the moment. So we usually have sort of 4 or 5 volunteers per day on a rolling basis. So we've got a good enthusiastic bunch. So.
Fantastic. In lack of other questions coming in, I can just peruse this time to keep asking, I guess. So back to the beginning of your talk, so this is something I wrote down right in the beginning what I thought of, and these breakthroughs that you mentioned, these different innovations in the build-up. I'm wondering, where did they come from geographically? So is this a global effort in boat design? Is this nothing specific that you could pinpoint, or is this specifically 1 or 2 countries that were very interested in sailing dinghies?
Well, I think in Britain we can actually say that we did a lot of the development with Uffa Fox. With so many of those early developments, he was British, so he developed planing and the trapeze. That's two very big developments that happened. After that, the hydrofoils, that was kind of more of a, well, globalization was coming in much more then. Collaborations around the world, everyone was trying it, and I think Australia also. There's a very cultural thing of sailing there, and New Zealand. They do a lot of sailing as well. So I think once it got to hydrofoils, they've really led the way. And well, they're New Zealand are the current defenders of the America's Cup, so they're obviously right up there at the forefront of performance sailing now. But yeah, historically through the sort of 30s, 40s, the UK was the place to be with developments. So
awesome. You just mentioned trapezing as well. Sorry, were you saying something else? I think the connection's gone a bit unstable again.
No.
Oh, okay, great. You just mentioned trapezing again. I think at the beginning of your talk you mentioned that was actually banned then in races.
Yes, it was. That was the cultural thing.
Yeah.
That the people wanted it to be a gentleman's sport, and it took 15 years after that to really get the cultural shift that allowed people to be more athletic in boats. And I think that's one of the reasons why the development kind of moved over to Australia and New Zealand when it came to hydrofoils, because they hadn't had the same ban. So while the UK had kind of been stagnating, not being allowed further development, of US and New Zealand were allowed free rein a bit more.
I'm wondering do you know of any other developments that were maybe banned in some places for brief periods of time that could have stagnated further developments too?
Well, the hydrofoils in certain types of boat, they were banned, and well, in some types of racing classes they're not allowed today. But generally, the trapeze ban was more widespread across the whole of the UK Sailing Association. I think it was the International Sailing Association at the time, and that was much more widespread. And since then, any bans have been much more individual to a type of boat. So if someone really wanted to go hydrofoiling, they could just go to a different boat where they could use them. So since the trapezing, nothing much has been banned. But actually, just before the trapeze, there was the run for a sliding seat. So it was effectively a plank that slid across the boat, and exactly the same as the trapeze, allowed you to get your weight further out. That was banned as well. But that was only a couple of years before trapeze that was banned. So.
Fair enough, thank you. Steve did just bring another question in. So asking about boat restorations again. Is restoring a molded wooden hulled boat like that of the Firefly basically just a case of reconstructing the hull from scratch?
In a way, yeah. You've got to build it, restore it the same way they built it, really. So you'll have to, if you've got a hull, you'd have to take off layers and then remove the damaged section and then build the layers back up. So it would be the same as building it, but just on a sort of small area rather than the whole thing in the same place.
So a little bit easier.
Yeah, and also we've got modern adhesives now. So when they were first built, they had to go into an oven to cure the glue, but now they've got stronger glues that don't need the whole boat to be put in an oven again.
Yeah, must be massive ovens they used.
Yeah.
Henry just comments he can remember Team Phillips and Pete Goss in 2000 who tried sailing with a fine elongated hull that was designed to go through the waves and failed with that.
Yes, we've actually got a section of the bow of that at our storage. We've got a section that washed up on a Cornish beach. So.
Oh wow, that one of the spectacular crashes that you mentioned.
Yeah. In theory, that should have worked. But from what I've heard, the construction of it wasn't done to a high enough standard. So it theoretically might have worked, but it was probably let down by the quality of its builders.
Fair enough, and that was never tried again then in a better way. Great. So some people seem to be leaving us already, but we've talked for ages. And with a lack of other questions. Oh wait, just as I'm saying it, Robin asks one more thing. Just how athletic or agile do you need to be to sail a high performance boat? Is there a lot of physical strength involved, or is it more like motor racing and coordination that you need in that sense?
Well, something I find wonderful about sailing is that there's a massive variation of boats. So whatever you want, there's a boat out there that can do it for you. So if you want to sort of sit back and go fast, there are some boats that, especially now, that allow, with the use of hydrofoils, to be quite a relaxed sail. But there are some very physically demanding boats out there. And I was fascinated in 2012, before the Olympics. They did an assessment of loads of different athletes, and they tested them for various things. And in terms of cardiovascular fitness, so as in how far you can run or whatever, they actually found that some of the sailors were fitter than the marathon runners because of the amount of energy you had to put out during a race and the amount of training they did. So there are classes out there that need an awful lot of fitness, and some of them that need an awful lot of strength. So no matter what you want, there's a boat out there that needs it.
It can definitely be a very strenuous sport as well.
Yeah.
And Robin says that's him out. Great. So before we do wrap things up, I just wanted to say again that the futuristic developments in the end that you mentioned, and I was especially fascinated by this wing sail, which I guess, in addition to the hydrofoils, really starts to blur the line between aeroplanes and boats in a sense, right? Yeah,
because the fastest boats are the ones that are least in the water, ironically. Yeah. So they're almost the least boat-like. There's always going to be a connection with the water, but who knows? Maybe get out the water completely one day.
I imagine development like that could be banned in sailing races.
It might be, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you very, very much, Reuben. I'm speaking for myself anyway. I really, really enjoyed that talk. Absolutely fascinating. And I learned so much today. Really great. As I said, there's been some really nice comments in the chat. Do have a read through that before you head off. You have just frozen for me. Oh no, you are still here. Great. Before we log off, what we usually do at this point is we try and unmute everyone, and then people can give you a quick round of applause or say thank you as wanted. So we'll try that out. Right, everyone should be unmuted if they want to. So thank you very much, Reuben. I really enjoyed the talk today.
That was amazing, Reuben.
Yeah, thank you.
Just before everyone heads off, or for those who are still there, we've got another marine themed talk next week about seaweed aquaculture this time. You should get the details too on the mailing list or see the talk on Eventbrite. Thank you very much, everyone, for showing up.